We're now going to really transition into journalism craft. And for reporters, I think all of us understand that immigration poses this very rich and complex series of challenges that are both local and national. And it's about the individual and the neighborhood, and at the same time about society and policy. We are lucky here to have 3 reporters who have devoted themselves to the immigration beat and have learned a lot along the way, some of which they're going to share. So we have Maria Sacchetti from the Boston Globe, and Michael Matza, who's been with us since yesterday, as has Cindy Carcamo from the LA Times. 3 of the great cities, 3 great immigrant cities, 3 cities in which these issues play out in different ways. I think we're going to start by having each of them talk about whatever's on their mind for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll go into a conversation. I know one of the issues we talked about a little bit was transparency and this idea that people are now beginning to self-identify. And you were saying that might be a place where you would begin. It poses some new challenges for us.
Yeah, we've heard some of this already in the conference about, it comes up in the context of the DREAM Act kids often, undocumented and unafraid. They're out there, they want you to know it, and they're in your face with it. But I'm going to propose a hypothetical to you, and this comes from, it's sort of a war story that I think has some meaning. You've decided to do a story about birthright citizenship, which I think you all know what that is, the issue that it doesn't matter what your parents' immigration status is, if you're born in the United States, you're automatically a U.S. citizen. And so in your reporting, you go to a local hospital where you meet the chief of obstetrics, and he tells you that he gives free ultrasounds to immigrant women, most of them undocumented, on the theory that they live right near his hospital. When they go into labor, it's very likely they're coming to his hospital, maybe to the emergency room, and he'd rather that they have prenatal care and show up healthy and deliver than come in with complications. And he's high enough in the hospital hierarchy that he's able to pull this off. It costs money, but he fights the bean counters and manages to give away these free ultrasounds. And through that program, you meet a woman who's Mexican, she's undocumented, she's in her 20s, and she's going to give birth, and she's pregnant. And you go to her house and you interview her about the issue about birthright citizenship and how she came here and so on and so forth. And when you get to her house, you realize, and they didn't set the house up for this, but there's an American flag pinned to the wall. She lives in America now with her husband, and the setting is unbelievable. She's pregnant, she's sitting on the sofa, there's an American flag in the background, she looks dead into the camera, and she knows, and you're interviewing her in Spanish, but I don't speak Spanish, I speak French. So I have an interpreter there, and I'm explaining what the Philadelphia Inquirer is, and what our circulation is, and what happens when we put a story on the front page, and in this day and age of internet and so on and so forth. You're out there. Once you're out there, and I can't promise you anything about what will happen once that happens. And she's nodding and saying, I get it, I know it, and she looks dead into the camera a la Demi Moore, and the photographer makes an awesome picture of her. It's fantastic. Now it's time to put the story in the paper, and editors look at it and they're thinking, oh my God, this could go viral. This is such a good picture. Forget the writing. This is such a good this is such a good picture. I don't know. It's a little too in your face. It's a little too. So what do you do? That's my question to you guys. And
let's start with you guys. I mean,
sure. Yeah, well, actually, Michael and I, we spoke about this last night, and about how this is one of those issues where people have different thoughts about it, and it can be very controversial. And obviously, I mean, it's one of those things where when I speak with someone who is in the country legally, and I make it I let them know that the story is going to be in the Los Angeles Times. It's a national newspaper. It's going to go online. Everyone's going to see the story, and that having their name in the paper, is obviously their choice. It's better because then you humanize the experience, this immigrant experience, and I always leave it up to the person to make that decision. And some people have different schools of thought on that. I think that if you let the subject know what basically what could happen, the outcome, that everyone's going to see their name in the paper and online, I think that's fair enough. I think that person can make an educated decision on that. Although, I don't know, how do you handle situations like that, Maria?
I mean, I think for us it's pretty simple. We ask people if they feel like this is very loud. Sorry. We just ask people, for their permission. Just like we would anybody, and we take their pictures and we put it in the newspaper. So as long as they understand.
But there is sometimes an almost just sort of a generational difference in understanding, I think. Which is, I think, Michael, what you're speaking about, that there's maybe it's especially at the editor role, or maybe it's generationally for us as reporters. We tend to think of our first responsibility to protect people, protect our sources, and we should. But then you have this generation, several of whom we've had represented over the course of the last 2 days here, who, as with certain other issues, seem to be very out there and are willing to put themselves out. Does this pose, clearly poses some questions for you.
Well, the issue, I think, is that very often newspapers, editors, are exercising a kind of paternalism in which they say, well, we better protect this person from themselves. She thinks she knows what she's doing, but she doesn't really. And I think that we shouldn't do that. I think that these are people who came from Puebla, Mexico. They found a way to get here. These are not totally naive people. They may not be media sophisticates in the way that, the mayor is or some, politician, but if they've been given enough Miranda warnings and explained that, this is a national newspaper and people back in your home country could see this with the internet, it's like this could go, you understand that? Once that's been conveyed, I think we should let the people, this is a civil rights movement. These people want to assert themselves for their civil rights and not be protected from themselves, So I just think that, and yet, in the instance with this photograph, the question was, well, did the photographer take another one in silhouette? Like where if we wanted to use the picture, it wouldn't be her full face. And I think that actually is something that I don't know if there's, Jim has roots in photography and does other things too. But photographers among you should bear in mind that sometimes when you're going through the editorial process, it's always good to have that other picture, the one that if the paper or the TV station decides this is a little too,
or even if the source herself decides
that's
ultimately.
That's a very good point. If
the source herself subsequently says, I'm not quite as comfortable as I thought I was.
It is their life story ultimately, and I think you do have to completely honor that.
When you're,
sorry.
We'll go.
Yeah, one thing that really concerns me, it's just really loud. I'm just gonna, can I take it in my lap? I think it's like, I feel like I'm screaming. It doesn't sound that okay. It sounds loud to me.
It sounds loud to you. But
it does, okay, well then that's fine, I'll suffer, don't worry. But one thing we can never forget to do is our duty to be journalists, right? So, I hear a lot about the protecting of sources, but you should background every source you feature in the paper. So, if there's like a woman, like in your case, I would criminal check her. Right? I would find out what her criminal record is. You don't want to get that phone call the next day that she ran somebody over the year before, right? Which is totally possible, right? And we had a situation just this year where this fantastic kid, principal loved her, she was a DREAM Act kid. It was going to be a great story. Went to her graduation. Principal loved her, as I said. The guidance counselor loved her. And when I went to check her claim that she had gotten into 2 prestigious schools, they had no record of her. So we killed the story. And this happens again and again. Immigration is a minefield. So you have to really protect yourself as a journalist. And I protect my sources, and whether they're immigrants or not. And we're very upfront at the beginning, but you have to really protect yourself as a journalist and your integrity and make sure that you check out everybody. So.
Well, and this actually raises a question that we touched on yesterday in a session about refugee law, but there's something broader in it. How do you balance believing people who have compelling stories and verification? And actually, this is a challenging place for those of us who are doing this kind of reporting because of a sense of social engagement and stuff. And there's always the story that's too good to check, right? But in fact, it's especially difficult when you're talking about histories that may involve human rights abuse in another country, that may involve events that there were very few witnesses to. In your own reporting, how have you dealt with verification on these sensitive immigration stories?
Well, like with asylum cases, very often people are saying that they're oppressed, there's some kind of oppressed minority in their country, or they've been subject to torture or mistreatment, and as you point out, you don't know. First, just the same way you background people for criminal records, if it's a country that has some issues, there's the CIA fact book. There's all kinds of places that you can go and just read in. And now, of course, you're getting the CIA's official history of whatever the problem is. There are other sources too, but you can read in and find out what's going on in that country, really. And I've never done this, but I was thinking about this, that you could say, the thing about asylum is there's affirmative asylum, when you sort of get here and you ask for asylum immediately, and then there's kind of like, I don't know what they call it, defensive asylum or something like that, where you've been caught after being here illegally, and now you raise an asylum claim well out of the time that you should have, and those are sometimes more suspect than the ones where they touch their toe here and they ask for asylum. But I've never done this, but I've thought to myself, I'd read in enough to sort of say, oh, yes, you were in the movement, right? And the movement, well, were you at that big demo at the lake? Were you at that big demonstration? And there is no demonstration at the lake, right? And if the person says, oh, yeah, I was there. Yeah, it's like, I think, well, it's not a perfect BS detector, but it gives you a little gut feeling about whether the person is credible, I mean.
Yeah, well, for me, I think sometimes it's just gathering as much documentation as you can, especially if that person has, if that immigrant the subject basically has like an attorney, for instance. I did a story, it was a while ago at the Orange County Register, and it had to do with a transgender immigrant, a transgender woman from Honduras. And she basically, it was one of those things where the year had lapsed, so she couldn't apply for asylum anymore. So she got a stay of deportation. And I did a story about her. It was kind of like a vignette of different, voices of in the immigration movement. And I was able to get documents from the attorney that stated like her whole life story, because she basically has to make that claim, So I think that is a good way to do it, going through the courts, or trying to gather as much documentation as you can. Although sometimes it can be difficult, and I think Maria might be able to weigh in on that too.
Right, but I agree completely. I mean, if you're going to do a story on somebody, ask the lawyer to give you the documents, and if they're not giving you all the documents, like they're giving you just 3 pages of paper or something, then I wouldn't do the story. I mean, and ask for not only the lawyer's documents, and I'm sure you mean this, but also immigration documents, like the charging documents. If there was an interview of the person, and they approved her preliminary asylum interview, doesn't mean they believe her completely, but they believe she has a credible fear. Get that too. That will help you. The government's standing that story to a certain degree. So.
And it can be difficult too, I guess, sometimes with Department of Homeland Security when they don't want to give up information because they say it's all about privacy and protecting the person, the subject. So definitely, I think that is one of the obstacles. It's one of the challenges. Even if you have an A number, they won't give you information sometimes, or they do if you decide to sue them, maybe. So that's one of the huge challenges.
Yeah.
Let me ask you all about something a little bit different, and that's source development within immigrant communities. This is, for folks on the immigration beat, both crucial and so challenging. There are, in any given community, a handful of leaders or organizations who are out there all the time who may or may not be representative. Yeah. There are people with strong advocacy agendas, and then there are an awful lot of folks, including people we've had described this weekend, who are normally voiceless, normally invisible, not the kinds of people who would think of picking up the phone and calling one of you. Do you, how do each of you think about this question of source development over time on your beat? How do you approach it? Maria, how do you think of it?
So I talk to everybody, so people on all sides of the debate all the time. I try to source at least once a week, meet someone new or catch up with someone I haven't talked to. And I actually have something on this, how I source everywhere. So I try to source with advocates, consulates, immigration lawyers are great sources, and not just kind of to call for reaction to a story, but to go have a conversation with them. So, and of course, immigrants themselves directly, like go up to them on the street and talk to them. It's amazing, the kind of stories you'll hear. Go to their work sites, go to places. I mean, if you go to the work site, you might terrify them, but usually, there's some things you can do. Hang out in the cafes where they hang out in. But I also think it's really important to give people your card, give people your cell phone number, and ask them pointed questions. Like advocates, for example, if they're doing their job the right way, they're probably overwhelmed, right? And they're not going to remember to call you. And immigrants, I always say, just because you haven't heard about this as a problem doesn't mean it's not a problem. Immigrants don't pick up the phone and call you, right? So I say to them, have you ever heard of this? Have you ever heard of a woman who doesn't match ICE's priorities being detained, or a man? Have you ever heard of someone's children being taken away? Have you ever heard of this, that, or the other thing? If you have, call me, here's my cell phone, day or night. And I say that to them. And then it puts it in their mind. And then I make them put my cell phone in their phone. Like I'll call them and then, hey, this is your cell phone, this is my cell phone, great. And now I've been doing that for years. Now I'm getting calls from jail. So like you can actually set up an account so that immigrants can call you, collect from jail. And give you their alien number, yeah, and so it's really helpful. I mean, sometimes these are stories, the guy has a felony and, he's being deported for that reason and might not do a story. They're following the law. But in many other cases, including a lawyer from Philadelphia, there was a woman who had her asylum claim approved, preliminarily, but still approved, and she was still in jail, and she was the only caretaker for her 2 children. And as soon as we asked ICE about it, I asked for an interview. That's the other thing that is, I always ask for an interview. And then they let her out. And they said they were setting up the interview and they were really rushing her to South Station to put her on a train or bus. So we managed to get over there and interview her before she left. But these kinds of things happen, and it shows how important our roles are, I think, as journalists to really, follow this. So.
Yeah. How do you think about this?
Well, I mean, on any beat, there's a mix of stories that are kind of edgy, and then there are some that are more features, so to speak. And I did one. There's a part of Philadelphia, Southwest Philadelphia, which has had a big influx of African immigrants. And there's an organization down there called ACANA. I'm forgetting what the acronym stands for at the moment, but one of those A's is Africa. And it turns out that it's run by a Liberian guy named Vofi Jabata. And so I went out there and I did a sort of a feature about how this part of the city was being kind of revitalized by this particular group of immigrants from Africa. And, it would be very provincial to think that, all Liberians know all other Liberians, or, but the fact is that in some of these small immigrant communities, if you...
All Liberians really do.
Well, yeah, and about a year later, there was a terrible house fire in which like half a dozen Liberian children were killed. And the woman in the house was married to an Ivorian guy from Cote d'Ivoire. But to make a long story short, working my Liberian network, I was able to sort of get to the people I had to get to for the house fire story, which was a tragedy. But so, you know, it's like you work your beat and you just don't ever throw away a number, don't ever, you know, the obvious stuff, but I mean, just keep it all so that you can go back to it.
How much time a week do you put into new source development, do you think?
I don't usually think of it as specific like that. I mean,
Yeah.
but after every story that I write, and at least once or several times in a week, I'm so technologically backward that I just keep like a giant list of sources that now with computers you can search, so I'll be entering stuff like that at least once a week and probably more times than that.
I've found actually that hometown associations have been so helpful for me in my stories. I did a series, was it last year, for the Orange County Register about smuggling along the Pacific Ocean from Baja California to California. And the story kind of developed where I noticed that, just on the cops beat, our cops reporters were reporting on these boats being washed up, like in Orange County, and they had been, that had been happening in San Diego for a bit. So I thought automatically that was a great story, and being able, but the hardest part was to find people who had made those journeys, right? And for me, it was so important that the sources that I developed on other stories, just people who know people who know people, and it's kind of like that for instance, for some reason in the community of people from Guerrero and Santa Ana in particular, I was able to meet people who know people who know people who happen to be on one of those boats. So I think that's so important to just kind of touch base with your really good sources, those people that know everyone, like this guy also who knew everyone. He kind of ran his hometown association, and from Guerrero, and he was able to find me all of these great sources, and they were able to take me in country, and I was able to visit, and because of him and the network of people that he knew. That to me has been really helpful, or hometown associations in the communities that you live in.
What about interview technique? I mean, it strikes me that when you're dealing with people whose first language is not English, and maybe often is not English at all, either if you're a non-Spanish speaker and you're working with a translator, and that brings some special interview challenges, or you're dealing with people who are undocumented and fearful, and that may bring interview challenges. You're dealing with folks who normally don't interact with reporters at all, and that brings interview challenges. What do you find are the most important sort of interview lessons on this beat that you have learned over the years? What do you think is specific to this beat, or at least has enhanced your ability to work these stories?
I would say just with translators, I was a foreign correspondent in the Middle East. I can read Hebrew, but I don't speak it. I can't read Arabic or speak it, but so I would use translators for both of those languages. And as I was telling you, I used someone for Spanish. You got to tell your translator, tell me exactly what they say. Don't tell me she said she went to the store. Speak as if you're her, And that's obvious, but a lot of translators don't know how to do that. They listen for a second, and then they kind of sum up, and it's like, that's not a quote, That's kind of a paraphrase.
Working with translators, in my experience, also slows things down in what can be a good way or a not good way. How do you work that rhythm?
The good way is that sometimes when you're fluent in a language, I know sometimes I'll show up for an interview English to English, and sometimes either the person I'm interviewing or through my own foolishness will be down in the weeds of something before you know it, when you haven't gotten your arms around the central concept of the story. It's like you're off on some tangent, and it's like, well, wait, what's the central story? When you're working with a translator, you keep going over it and saying, so am I getting it right? Did they say they came on a plane or they came on a boat? It's like, that kind of stuff. The slowing down actually can make it
Yeah.
better.
Maria, what about you in interviewing? What do you think of as kind of at the heart of interviewing on this beat?
I mean, I think, I don't know, I feel like my interviews are often so meandering, I'm so inarticulate, and we just kind of chat and have conversations, but I think what's very important for me is to be extremely upfront in the beginning and kind of get, so you don't have any, get stuck in awkward conversations at the end, like, oh, this is on the record, or oh, is this, you just kind of just take care of all of that in the beginning. This is what I'm going to use, this is what I'm going to say, this is what your name, and then kind of, talk. And that's when, you don't have to say that at the very moment you meet them. You want to put people at ease and maybe have a conversation and then explain why you want to interview them. And then say, okay, we're going to do the interview, and this is what it's going to be like, and this is what I'm going to say.
So really having important. The contract be very clear.
Right, because you want them to be honest with you, and you can convey that. You want them to be totally upfront. Is there anything in your background I should know about? Because I'm going to get the phone call the next day. Is there anything going on? And you have to be extremely upfront with them too, and they'll trust you, I think, more.
Yeah, I think it's the same with me too. I try to. Let them know up front that this is a story that many people are going to read. If they are okay with that, then do they need time to think about it? I think that's really good to kind of have that foundation down before you really start getting into the story. At least for me, I think that's been very helpful. I agree with you.
For economy's sake too, you don't want to go through it 20 minutes and then at the end they say, oh, don't use my name and don't use it. It's like then you want to just shoot yourself, But by the same token, you sometimes like you, I think I kind of wander into the interview a little bit before I don't come in and say, all right, you're on the record now. Let's start talking. It's a more subtle thing, but before long, before more than 2 or 3 minutes, you want to know if they're going to be on the record. Otherwise, you could talk for a half hour and.
Because it can be days or weeks before you persuade someone to actually do the interview.
Yeah.
And it's the payoff can be great. It can be an amazing story. It's just,
What's one? There are a lot of years cumulatively on this beat here. What's one thing that you either do differently now that you've kind of learned to do differently as a result of writing about immigrants and refugees? What's something that you wish you had known at the beginning of taking this beat that you would advise? What's something that's changed in your practice as a result of doing these stories?
For me, something that's changed is that's actually been something that's been very controversial. The whole, whether to say or illegal immigrant or undocumented immigrant or just the language of the conversation. When I first started out, I would say undocumented immigrant or illegal immigrant. I would use it like no big deal. But since then, things have pretty much changed. And I remember I went to a workshop once, this is in DC, put on by the International Center for Journalists, and they got into this whole conversation about language, and they had people on both sides, the anti-illegal immigration activists and the immigrant rights activists. They had, which is really interesting, their arguments for and against, whatever verbiage, whatever kind of wording. So now what I do is when I write my stories, I try to stay away from labeling and saying illegal immigrant or undocumented immigrant. I say basically what it, I say, I don't know, Juan Gonzalez, who came to this country on a visa, overstayed his visa and is now in the country illegally. Or I'll say so-and-so who is suspected of being in the country illegally. Or, so it's better to kind of show, your reader, and I think it's even better because it kind of shows the different ways people can kind of slip out of legal status. It's not just someone crossing the border in Nogales making a run for it. People, actually a lot of people who are in the country illegally are overstays or visa overstays. So I think that that's one thing that has changed, although
so more precision in
yes,
your
more
language.
precision in my writing, and although that's really difficult for people who put together the headlines. But yeah, so that's what I do now.
Maria, what's something that's changed in your practice?
I think I would have gone directly to the immigration courts and into jails even faster than I did. I went in pretty soon, but we did a series last year on secrecy in the immigration system, and just briefly, I'll just say, the immigration system, Department of Justice and Homeland Security are the largest law enforcement agencies in the country. And they're the only ones in the United States that we let make secret arrests, secretly detain people, and largely secretly prosecute them. I mean, most court hearings are public, but you can't examine the evidence, and you can't get the alien number, and the Obama administration's made it harder to get the alien number. They're secret. So how are you supposed to examine, how do we know that they're treating people well? I mean, immigrants are still dying in detention. They're still having these complaints about sexual assaults and things like that. I mean, immigrants are not entitled to lawyers. How are they, if you're in detention, 8 in 10 detainees don't have lawyers. So, and they don't have hearings. So we have a lot of serious issues. I think this is an issue, it's always been secret. And so going back to Ellis Island, and it's something I think journalism as an institution has neglected for more than a century. So I feel pretty strongly about looking into that.
That's great.
So.
Like Cindy, we don't say illegal immigrant anymore. We say undocumented immigrant, and a style book change at the newspaper. And that's fine, except I was at the press club in Washington one time in the bar, sitting next to somebody who said, well, they're not undocumented. They have documents. They're just not legitimate documents, And I had to admit, oh, well, I guess I do see your point there. So it's a minefield, It doesn't matter what language we change to. There's always going to be some caveat.
But how has the beat changed your reporting?
I think again, I was a Middle East correspondent, and very often you see, Palestinian militants did whatever. It's like, well, militant? What's a militant? In other words, so from that experience, I learned to do the kind of precision writing that you're talking about. Describe exactly, was it, were they gunmen? Were they, who were they exactly in that context? And the same is true now in our writing about immigration. We try and describe how is it that the person slipped from either legal status into illegal status, or did they cross without inspection? That's a big thing for the immigration courts. They get more aggravated with somebody who literally crossed, in some place where they were never inspected, versus somebody who came in on a visa and then overstayed. At the end of the day, they're both out of status, but our system gets crankier about those who just evade. So it's important to make those distinctions.
Let's go to some questions from the room, and then we'll see where it goes. So, someone? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm curious about what you do when you find yourself deep enough into somebody's story that you find them generally credible, and then you encounter a lie. A small kind of lie, a fake birth certificate, a something or other, that, to what degree does or should that undermine the totality of their story? And do you kill it, or do you fight for a 3,000-word thing with hyperlinks to every document from UNHCR to try and kind of spell out what's truth and what might not be? Or how do you grapple with that?
Great question.
I think it depends on what they're lying about too. For me, I would have a serious conversation with that person and ask them, okay, and what other ways have you not been transparent with me about? And I would also have a conversation with my editor, for sure, right away, because you have to protect yourself, and you want to be transparent with your editor too, that you're having maybe these doubts. Okay, now what else did this source lie to me about? Right? That's what I would do. I haven't been in my immigration reporting, I haven't had a situation like that yet. I've had it in other reporting where we've actually killed the story. Yeah, because we just wonder, okay, what else is this person not being truthful about?
Yeah, that's a great answer.
Marie, you mentioned, you said that you say up front to folks, is there anything I should know? And have there been times when subsequently you found out things that you wish they told you in the first place?
Yes. Like that girl, we killed that story, and that was bad. It's on the internet. Somebody else wrote it. I think an advocacy journalist. But there was another case where I was investigating mortgage fraud, and a guy was actually a victim of identity fraud, and it was true. But then I criminal checked him because he was prominent in the story, and he happened to have a drug conviction. It was minor, and but I asked him about it. I hadn't asked, did you have a drug conviction? So we ended up kind of disclosing that in the story and using the story anyway. So you just have to protect yourself. I think you really have to remember that, you know, because you want people to believe you, you know, and
Yeah,
so.
your credibility's on the line, especially when it comes to immigration reporting. It's so emotional and so controversial, and just one little slip like that, it's just fodder for either side to kind of go after you, I think, too. So you have to be really careful.
Good question.
You just briefly mentioned secrecy around immigration courts, prosecution, detention centers, which is the element of this issue that I'm really interested in. And I was wondering if you can talk more about what kind of tools and workarounds, you know, especially with investigative journalism, if you're reaching just a total brick wall on those issues, or if the story then becomes that brick wall, like what kind of tools you've used to work around that secrecy.
Well, I mean, we use FOIA, so I FOIA everything. You can get judges' decisions. When you file your FOIAs, try to really tailor them so that it's not just that you want to know, even though you should have a right to know those hearings are public, but that you're also, you know, want to examine the government's actions in these cases. You know, that's kind of like very crucial to the FOIA law. You know that, you know, and if there is a question of the government's integrity in the case, then you should mention that as well. We did with the president's uncle's relatives' deportation hearings. You know, we FOIA'd all their court decisions because there was a clear question of integrity, and another one came up this week. I would really go to the jails, and more to the point, though, I would go to the immigration courts. I think if you haven't been and sat through it, like one day of immigration court, it will blow your mind if you've ever been in regular criminal court. And so somebody's nodding, I mean, it is really mind-blowing. I think here you have a court, almost 1 in 3 courts are inside jails, which is another really fascinating thing, right? And this is the United States of America. Where would you ever find a court inside a jail? Well, in the immigration system. And so, okay. And so and I was looking at that. You have one in York, Pennsylvania. Yeah. Have you been there?
I haven't been in that court.
I don't know if Pennsylvania's a big state, but I mean, I don't know where it is exactly.
It's not far. It's not.
Oh.
I mean, it's where most of the immigrants that are in detention go. In fact, you mentioned that you're interested in detention issues. I did a story just 2 weeks ago about a woman who committed suicide in immigration detention at York.
Oh, yes. So that's I'm so glad you mentioned that, because, and that's a terrible thing. So the other thing that is really quite shocking about this is immigration. The way the system works right now, immigration will only tell you that they have someone in their custody if they're dead. That's it. So that's a bit late, right? I mean, so you don't want to know if they're sick or if they're dying or whatever, you know. And then that happened to a woman in Lynn. She was 29 from Lynn, Massachusetts. She was 29 years old. She was detained by immigration. Immigration agents make the decision to give bail, right? I know. And so someone was their mouth, but immigration agents are the ones who decide bail. You can ask for a bond hearing in front of an immigration judge, who's not really a judge. They work for the Department of Justice, right? And so all of this is in our series. If you feel like reading, it's free, hopefully. If it's not, email me and I'll send you the free links. But so immigration agents make decisions to grant bail. And she had a deadly heart condition that she needed medication for. And this is 2011. And her jailers didn't give her that medication, and she died at age 29, 12 days later. She had a plane ticket home. They could have put her on a plane to France. And her lawyer said, you know, the thing is, she knew she was dying because she knew she needed that medication to live. That's an incredibly profound thing. And that's why I think our responsibility as journalists is so important, because often the only public hearing they're going to get is us if they manage to reach us. So we also have to go looking for these stories. And so I'm sorry I don't mean to hijack. But when someone dies, you should always ask for the Office of Professional Responsibility death report. I file a FOIA for it right away, and then I call them, and you should call and be persistent. You're going to have to fight for everything. But that will outline, they're usually pretty straightforward, and that will outline what happened in the case, whether they acted appropriately or whether they didn't.
What is it, the Office of Responsibility?
It's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Office of Professional Responsibility. And they do, it's mandatory that they do a death report or an investigation. And the states often do death and investigations as well. And sometimes those conflict. Like they'll say the jailers were not, the state will say the jailers were not responsible, and ICE will say they are, and then and call the consulates too.
That office has been assigned. I put copies of the suicide detention story that I was telling you about on the end of each of these tables. That office is supposedly going to look into. This woman was 34 years old. She was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia at 15. So she had like a long history of, she was from Antigua. Make a long story short, she hung herself. The other thing that we're talking about here is if you have a lot of sources, by the time you accumulate a lot of sources, and with a lot of lawyers too, it turned out that a lawyer who represented another woman who was in the same seclusion unit that this woman was in when she killed herself was in it's a six-cell pod, and while she couldn't see her, because of the way the pods were arranged, she couldn't see into the cell of the woman who hung herself. When the emergency team came in to get her, someone was, one of the guys was shouting, "I need a knife, I need a knife," to cut her down from the bed sheet that she was hanging with. And then she saw her get taken out on a gurney, and then immigration released that woman. That woman, and since I learned about this through her lawyer, I was able to interview her. She was an eyewitness, more or less an eyewitness to what happened on the day that this woman.
So you can look for corroborative eyewitness stuff through contacts with attorneys and constituencies themselves, where there may be people who are out of immigration.
Yeah, I mean, and it is surprising that sometimes they bounce somebody out. Like the one that you were looking at, they put them on, they sort of like said, "Oh, well, let's get her out of here."
It's happened to us 7 times.
Make a call
Did that woman have a lawyer, the mentally ill woman?
She did.
Cindy, how do you deal with these secrecy issues?
Well, yeah. Maria's been a watchdog when it comes to that. That's awesome. In regards to secret, what I tend to do is at the LA Times, it's nice because we kind of have a team of reporters that we all have like immigration that touches our beat. So actually, I'm a national correspondent, and I focus on immigration and border issues out of Arizona. But we also have Brian Bennett, for instance, who covers immigration from DC. So he actually he is very well sourced up there. So we actually help each other out when we're hitting a wall. So that's been very, very useful. And also we have immigration reporters in LA. So we'll kind of huddle together and we'll devise like a strategy.
And I can add to that kind of collaboration and cooperation doesn't only have to happen within a single news organization. I'm aware of some very important immigration stories that have happened. One involving, for instance, an NPR correspondent, Michelle Morisco, in Tucson, who partnered with a reporter in Omaha, Nebraska, involving a story involving an illegal. A narco who was in the country illegally, who had assassinated a journalist in Mexico. But it was by collaborating across the country, we're able to follow a kind of trail. And that can also happen on other kinds of immigration stories.
Yeah, that's nice. And that, you have to see whether your news organization is cool with that. That's another whole other story.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Something else from the room.
Thank you all for this. So, and related to detention facilities right now, I know there have been some sorts of policy moves to decrease the number of beds. And I was wondering if you could talk about what you're seeing right now within detention facilities and what kind of developments you think we can expect to see in the next few years. And then also as well related to action on the border and what you're sort of foreseeing.
I can talk about the border. Since I'm in Arizona, the bureau, which is actually just my house, is about 2 hours away from the border. Actually, it seems like from what I've seen and the people that I've spoken with is that actually a lot of illegal immigration has moved from Arizona to Texas. Like everyone's looking at Texas as like the new frontier of illegal immigration. And it's so bad in Texas, apparently, from what I've read and from my sources, and what they've told me is that that the coroners or the medical examiners just can't deal with the amount of deaths that they're seeing. It's kind of like Texas is the new Arizona. There's still illegal immigration through Arizona, but it's definitely shifting to Texas. And it's an area that's a lot less fortified, and it's a lot less, it's really difficult to fortify because you have, you just have these natural, almost like barriers. So it's, that I would be looking at Texas, actually. I think Texas is like the new place in regards to border crossings.
I have a question for all of you. This came up a little bit yesterday, and that's about selling your editors on what it is you need to do. I mean, part of the challenge is that editors, like the rest of us, are all trapped by conventional wisdom and conventional views of what the story is. Each of you have done path-breaking reporting that has kind of taken immigration and refugee stories in new directions that have been kind of off the agenda. How do you do that? How do you work your editors?
Well, I don't know. I can talk a little bit about that. I was at a news. I'm very fortunate now. I'm at the LA Times, and they have a lot of resources for now, and so it's not as difficult, for instance, to travel for a story. But I've been in situations at my last newspaper where they didn't have the budget. You know, a lot of newspapers, a lot of organizations are contracting, and they don't have, like, for instance, the travel budget. For me, it was very important, I think, on the immigration beat, to tell a full and nuanced story that will take you in country. For instance, right? That will, like, for instance, the story that I did on human smuggling along the Pacific Ocean on these small fishing boats. It took me to Guatemala, and to be able to tell those real human stories of this woman, for instance, who was one of the first casualties on these panga smuggling trips. But to be able to sell that story, I mean, my newspaper did not have any budget, did not have a budget to send me, so I ended up actually at the Register. A lot of the series that I did, the projects that I did were on, because I looked for my own money. So I looked for my own grants, I looked for, like, fellowships, and it kind of became a joke. Like, I became like a fellowship junkie because, because, you know, it was a great way to be able to fund the stories that I really wanted to do, to tell this fuller story of what was actually happening in Orange County. It was connecting to places in Mexico and places in Guatemala, and so I just kind of took it upon myself to look for that. And it's kind of hard for an editor, although they still could, to say no when you're like, oh my gosh, guess what? We have like $8,500 that we can spend on this story. Let's do it. You know, I mean, all you need to do is give me the time off to do it, and we'll have this amazing story that's going to connect with our readers. So that helped me, and I was fortunate enough to be able to do those stories because I kind of looked for my own funding. So that might help, but I don't know, the dynamic in newsrooms can be different. But that, I think, if you kind of bring the money to the table, that might help, right? So.
Maria, how do you sell this stuff in Boston?
I mean, my editors are really supportive. I feel really lucky. They're smart. They understand, I think, the world. We used to have a foreign desk. We don't anymore, but there's still that feeling of understanding, wanting to cover the world. And I think research can really help you. You know, when I say, you know, I want to go to Haiti, it's like, oh, well, you know, why do you want to go to Haiti? Well, we have the third largest number of Haitians in the United States, and we have this and that, and this is why this is important.
Okay, so,
You know,
so
so
actually
research is
having,
really-
doing your research
Yeah.
and having
Yeah.
that homework, having done that homework
Yeah.
ahead of the discussion of the editor, before the door is closed. Okay.
That's huge.
Michael?
And I would say just being able to tell your editor why this iteration of what you're writing about, I mean, you're going to know it at a really nuanced level. Even with the best editors, they're doing so many other things, they're not going to know your beat the way you do. But if you come to them with something, explain to them why should we cover this demonstration? Is it any different than the other demonstration that we covered or something? Very often they just hear it as, okay, so advocates are going to go to the ICE office and be angry in front of them. You know, it's like, sometimes that's the way an editor will see it. You'll have to sort of, if you're going to do that kind of story or anything like that, you're going to need to get over a higher hurdle. It's got to do something more than the last version of that we did.
I have one more question for each of you, and then we can maybe break for lunch. Part of doing immigration and refugee reporting, as we've been talking about over the last couple of days, involves immersing yourself at length in what is often very dark and challenging material. You've got communities that have escaped genocide, Cambodians or civil war, Guatemalans and Salvadorans, people who have horrific experiences coming here or having been trafficked or exploited once they are here, who are in jail now or are fearful of it, who are dealing, as we were discussing yesterday, with high levels of mental illness and distress. How do you take care of yourselves on this beat? What do you do to kind of keep from being losing your balance or being poisoned by what is really a pretty consistent diet of dark stuff at times?
Please start.
Gosh, that's a good question. I have no idea, to be quite honest with you, in regards to how you take care of yourself. I love what I do, and I feel so honored to be able to go on these journeys with people that I don't even see it as dark. I see it as just a different kind of reality. And for instance, when I followed this Guatemalan deportee, this guy on an immigration and customs enforcement flight back to Guatemala, and I followed the first 48 hours of him being, a deportee back, and actually it wasn't so dark. I think it was very complicated. It was very nuanced. His story was different. And you really, I mean, he never saw himself, and I didn't see him also, as a victim. And I think that sometimes, sometimes we tend to victimize people as journalists. You're like, oh, that poor little immigrant, and sometimes that's not the case at all. This guy was very savvy. He knew what he was doing. And his story was a different story. I mean, obviously, there are people who are victims who have lost everything in Guatemala, and they go to the U.S. illegally because they really are on the verge of starving. But that's not the story for everyone. So I think that's my goal as a journalist, is to tell the immigration story in a more nuanced way. So it doesn't come off as the same poor victim, kind of story, right? So obviously, I mean, you have those stories, but for me, that's been what I've experienced. So.
How do you think about this one?
I'm not sure if this is right on point, but it doesn't happen often, but sometimes you do something in a story that just makes you feel good for having done it, and I'm thinking about a story that I went to Haiti twice after the earthquake, and I wrote about a woman who lost her arm. Her arm had to be amputated. And I was there when I was in the operating room. I saw her have her arm removed. I became very deeply involved in that. And I wrote about it. Hanger Orthopedic Company saw that story here. They decided to make her an arm, like not one of these super bionic $100,000 arms, but a very basic arm, but it was worth about $8,000. And fit her with it as if not the first, one of the first people to get an arm in Haiti. They did a lot of legs, but there weren't too many arms. Arms are more complicated. And it was really dark. Her life, she was a domestic. She now had 1.5 arms to do housework with. She had a 5-year-old child. I saw where she lived. It was like a walk-in closet in an American home, is where she lived with herself, her child, and 2 other people. It was really dark, but I felt really good for having been involved, So occasionally you get uplifted.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think we were on the ground a day and a half after the earthquake in Haiti, and I've never seen really anything like it. And I think it's okay to understand that, like, being in those circumstances or listening to someone's stories over and over again, or reading these reports that are horrific. That they can affect you. Maybe you will have nightmares, and maybe, and kind of to address that. I mean, if it really bothers you, it's okay, and to talk to somebody about that. I think what I try to remember is, like, this did not happen to me personally, did not happen to my family. Yes, I'm experiencing it, but I have a job to do here, and it's really important that other people read about what's going on. And I think that propels you through it, and it clears my mind, definitely. Also, exercise. It really helps. Right. I mean, for real, I'm completely addicted to rowing, and it really just helps, and you concentrate on something else for a while. So I think that's good.
Okay, well, I think on that note, we can continue the conversation over lunch. Let's break, and we'll come back in about a half hour. We're running a few minutes late with Gary Pierre, who's already here, and Alia Malik, who will show up eventually, and continue the conversation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.